My name is Faye, and I was 33 years old on the night everything changed. It was a Tuesday in March, and the weather in West Texas was doing what it does best, being mean. The rain wasn't just falling. It was coming at the world sideways, driven by a wind that wanted to knock over anything still standing. It was the kind of storm that settles in for hours, turning the ground to mud and the air to cold. I was at my place, 40 minutes from my parents' house, trying to keep my focus on work, when my phone buzzed. A neighbor I barely knew sent me a text saying my granddad was sitting outside on a front porch in the middle of the downpour. She said he had all his bags with him. I didn't wait. I got in my car, made that 40-minute drive in 30, my heart beating hard the whole way, trying to understand why an 80-year-old man would be sitting outside in a storm like that. To understand how we got to that porch, I have to go back 8 months. My grandfather, Harold Anderson, had owned a ranch for 51 years. He worked that land every single day of his life. When someone offered him $1.2 million for it, he sold. But he didn't keep the money. He did something most people would call reckless. He gave every single penny to my father, Roy. He didn't put it in a trust with conditions attached. He didn't have a lawyer draw up a contract with rules and timelines. He just moved the entire $1.2 million into my father's checking account on a Friday afternoon. And I was sitting at the kitchen table when it happened, watching my coffee go cold because I couldn't stop staring at them. My father kept saying he didn't have to do this. My grandfather was a man who didn't like to waste words. He looked at my dad and said 3 simple things. Take care of me. That was the whole deal. A handshake and a promise. My mother, Linda, sat across the table with her arms folded and her head nodding, like she was the one who had made it all happen. I felt something wrong in my chest that I couldn't name yet. My grandfather was always careful with everything. Why would he hand over his life's work with nothing in writing? I asked him that directly. He gave me the slow smile he used when he thought I was almost smart enough to understand something. He told me that some things you write down and some things you find out. I didn't know what he meant. I thought it was just the kind of thing old men say. I was wrong about a lot of things that year. You have to know who Harold Anderson was to understand the rest of the story. He was a man who lived as though he had nothing, even when he had everything. He repaired his work boots with glue until they were more glue than leather. He had one blue coffee mug with a chip in the rim and washed it by hand every time he used it, every day for decades. When the air conditioner in his truck broke, he rolled the windows down and drove that way for 3 summers rather than spend money on a repair. We all assumed the ranch sale was every dollar he had in the world. We thought he had handed my father his entire life's work in one Friday afternoon transfer. He never told us otherwise. But every so often he would say something that didn't quite fit the picture we had of him. One afternoon after the sale, I drove him out to look at the empty ranch one last time. He looked out at the dry brown land and told me people thought it was just dirt, but the land was never just dirt. He had a small brass key on a string around his neck that he wore every day. He would reach up and touch it when he was thinking, the way some people fidget with a ring. When I asked what it opened, he grinned and said it opened something worth opening. I was going through my own hard time then. My small company had failed, and I had lost all my money, and I was living in a tiny apartment trying to find enough work to get by. When he talked about dirt and what it was worth, I wasn't really listening. I was too deep in my own sense of failure to hear what he was trying to tell me. He moved into my parents' house that week. They gave him the back bedroom, and at first things seemed workable, but then the phone call started. My mother would call me and speak in that particular worried voice, asking whether Grandpa had said anything about the house or the money, mentioning that he seemed to be getting confused. I understand now what she was doing. She was quietly building a case that he couldn't manage himself, laying the groundwork to take control of the money without ever having to account for where it went. My mother had grown up with nothing and had spent her adult life feeling owed something she had never quite received. She didn't see a father-in-law who needed looking after. She saw a bank account with a pulse. I didn't fully see the danger until that Tuesday night in March. When I pulled up to my parents' house through the sideways rain, there he was. My grandfather was sitting on the porch steps under the single light above the door, holding his old weather radio pressed against his chest. His bags were already soaking through. The house lights were off behind him. My father opened the door when I knocked and started making excuses, saying something about a van that was coming to take him to a nursing home. My mother stood just behind him and said Grandpa wasn't their problem anymore. She said they had done their part. I didn't argue with either of them. I walked past him to my grandfather, put my hand on his cold radio, and told him we were leaving. He looked up at me with completely clear eyes. He wasn't confused. He wasn't lost. He just said the same 3 words he had said at the kitchen table 8 months before. Take care of me. This time it wasn't a request. It was something he was placing in my hands, like a job he had already decided I was capable of doing. I put him in my truck, and we drove away from that house and didn't look back. My apartment was barely big enough for one person. I gave him the bed and slept on the couch. I spent my days managing his medications, making sure he had the foods he liked, keeping a running list of everything he needed and when. My parents didn't call once to check on him. My brother Dale sent a text saying I shouldn't make a big deal out of it, and that Grandpa was a lot to handle. That made me angrier than almost anything else. Harold Anderson was one of the quietest men I had ever known. He asked for nothing. He complained about nothing. The moment Dale sent that message, I made up my mind that I would never send my grandfather back to people who talked about him like he was an inconvenience, no matter what it cost me. My mother started telling the wider family that I had stolen Grandpa away to make myself look good, positioning herself as the wounded party. People believe her the way people usually believe a convincing story they didn't witness themselves. I felt very alone during that stretch, but I kept going. I called my parents once to ask for help covering his heart medication, which was expensive. My mother told me that since they had the money, their job was done. She used the word project when she talked about him. It was in that moment I finally understood clearly. The $1.2 million was never meant to care for Harold. It was payment to be free of him. But something was happening on the other side of that loneliness that I hadn't expected. My grandfather started helping me. He would sit and watch me work at my computer in the evenings, asking questions about my failed company. Curious about the soil sensors I had been trying to build for farmers before the money ran out. I told him the problem was cost. The components were too expensive, and I couldn't bring the price down far enough to make it work. He looked at his old weather radio sitting on the table between us and told me to make something simpler. He said most things people call complicated are just expensive excuses. We spent a whole week drawing ideas in a notebook. He showed me how radio signals could be used to help farmers predict weather patterns in ways that were cheap and practical and built for people who work with their hands. Working beside him was the first time I felt anything close to happy in over a year. He was finding his way back into usefulness, and he was pulling me along with him. By the 3rd month, he was sleeping more. He would drift off in the middle of a conversation, and his coffee would go cold on the table beside him. I was working 3 jobs to cover his doctors and his medications, and I was exhausted in a way I didn't let myself look at directly. One day he caught me counting his pill bottles with a look on my face that I thought I had been hiding. He told me I was doing that thing where I carry everything so nobody can see it. We both knew what was true, and we both pretended we were managing fine. A few days later, he asked me to drive him to a lawyer's office. He said there was something he needed to fix. The lawyer's name was Margaret. He went inside alone and came out looking peaceful and lighter in some way I couldn't quite describe. He told me he had fixed something he should have fixed years ago, and that I would find out what it was later. My brother Dale showed up not long after that, and it was clear within minutes that he had come for one reason. He wanted Grandpa to sign over some form of financial control to him. I told him that wasn't going to happen, and that he needed to leave. My grandfather heard the whole conversation through the wall, and just laughed quietly to himself when it was over. He told me they would get a signature eventually, but it wouldn't be the one they were looking for. Our last good night together was a Sunday. He told me that out of everyone, I was the only one who had never once asked what was in it for me. He said I had truly taken care of him, and the way he said it made it feel like something being closed properly, something settled. He went to bed earlier than usual. He died in his sleep that night. I found him in the morning with the weather radio still playing quietly on the nightstand. He had washed his blue coffee mug and put it away before he went to bed. Even at the very end, he was thinking about how to make things a little easier for me. When I called my mother to tell her he was gone, her first question was not whether I was all right. It was whether anyone had called a lawyer yet. At the funeral, she cried in a way that filled the whole room, telling everyone who would listen how deeply she had loved him. My father stared at the floor through the entire service. After the burial, Margaret told us to come to her office for the reading of the will. My family treated it like a formality. They had the money already. What else was there to hear? They were not prepared for what came next. Margaret told us that 8 weeks before he died, my grandfather had changed everything. And then she told us the secret Harold Anderson had kept for 46 years. In 1979, before any of us were part of his life, he had signed a mineral rights agreement for the oil and everything beneath his ranch. He had been receiving payments on that agreement for nearly half a century and had never spent any of it. He lived like a man with nothing while millions of dollars accumulated quietly in accounts none of us knew existed. The surface of the ranch, the dirt and the grass and the fences, had been worth $1.2 million. What was underneath, it was worth $20 million. The room went completely still. Then Margaret kept reading. My grandfather had written that the $1.2 million he gave my father was not a gift. It was an advance against his inheritance, which meant it would be subtracted from my father's portion of the estate because of how my parents had treated him. Put him outside in a rain store with his bags, walking away as though his care was a debt they had paid and were finished with. He had arranged for nearly everything to come to me instead. He left a letter explaining his thinking. He had wanted to see what people would do when they believed they already had all the money. He watched my parents stop caring for him the moment the transfer cleared, and he watched me show up for him when I had nothing to offer and nothing to gain. My mother's grief turned to fury in the space of a breath. She called me names and said I had manipulated a dying old man. But Margaret had documentation showing my grandfather's complete mental clarity at the time he made every decision, signed by professionals who had no stake in the outcome. My father sat very still and said one word, quietly, to no one in particular. He just said, Dad. He understood, sitting in that chair, exactly what he had thrown away and that there was no getting it back. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I picked up the folder Margaret handed me and the brass key that had hung around his neck all those years, and I walked out. It has been a year now. I used the money to build the company my grandfather and I designed together in that small apartment, drawing pictures in a notebook at the kitchen table. We make affordable weather tools for farmers. Simple, practical things built for people who work with their hands and can't afford expensive excuses. I also started a fund in his name to help families keep aging parents at home, rather than surrendering them to institutions because the cost became too much. I still have the blue coffee mug with the chip in the rim. I still have the weather radio. They sit together where I can see them every morning. And they remind me that showing up for someone when you have nothing to gain is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only thing that turned out to matter. A check can be cashed in a second. A promise is something else entirely. Harold Anderson knew the difference his whole life. He just needed to find out who else did.